And now, lecture will be presented by Maciej Jemioł, our doctorand from Jesuit University, Christian and Non-Religious Philosophy Against Naturalism, a Difficult Meeting Place in Culture.
Hello and welcome again. The topic of my presentation is Christian and Non-Religious Philosophies Against Naturalism, a Difficult Meeting Place in Culture. So I will approach the topic of today's conference from a very different perspective than my predecessors, but I hope that it will be nevertheless interesting to you. And the order of my presentation is as follows. I will start by discussing the opposition between Christian and modern non-religious philosophies. That is a very common subject in today even political discourse. Then I will go to diverging approaches to anthropological naturalism between those two ways of thought. Then I will go to converging approaches to anthropological naturalism, which are much more interesting as I will try to demonstrate. And then I will go to the conclusion about the theoretical possibility and real opportunity of a difficult meeting place in culture. So let me begin. The current Christian thought oftentimes felt itself at odds with various non-religious philosophies, such as transhumanism, postmodernism, modern approaches to humanism, feminism, postcolonialism, or queer thought. This is not a difficult observation to make. In fact, a popular motif in many current Christian writings by philosophers and in public political discourse alike is the motive of culture in crisis and consequently of siege mentality, where the crisis and the siege in question are both currently diagnosed as resulting from those modern, liberal, left-leaning, non-religious philosophies. Chantal del Sol claims that for more than half a century now, we are witnesses to what she calls the normative inversion, that lets itself known among by how all things that were once considered evil are now considered good. They are being appreciated and they are being praised. Among such things, she names homosexuality, abortion, divorce, and suicide in some cases, which are all phenomena which modern re-evaluation arose from that what we can generally call progressivism, liberalism, and left-leaning politics. Vittorio Possenti writes in turn about the current pedagogical crisis as a result of postmodern vision of education, where education is oriented towards instrumental goals rather than universal truths that can be found in God. Similarly, according to Sławomir Chrost, trans and post-humanism as well as multiculturalism bring about the risk of a post-metaphysical world that depreciates the innate value of the human person. In the United States, we have populists and propagandists of nominally Christian provenience, such as Matthew Walsh, Dennis Prager, that constantly bemoan the fall of the Western world, its culture and customs, and use very strong rhetoric in order to blame it all on various progressive groups and ideas, collectively denoted under the moniker of wokeness, or even the woke mind virus, as Elon Musk puts it. All this would seem to suggest that there is very little possibility of a meeting place between Christian thought and the woke non-religious philosophies of today. In this presentation, however, I will attempt to demonstrate that such a difficult meeting place in culture is not impossible. Coming from a Christian perspective, but also drawing from ideas of such non-religious thinkers as Sarah Ahmed, Judith Butler, Joanna Heinderek, or Gayatri Chakravorty-Spivak, my aim will be to discuss how many different approaches to the issue of naturalism diverge, but also converge, creating a rare possibility of dialogue between otherwise embattled worldviews. But first, an important methodological remark. While the question of defining naturalism is in itself a very broad problem with multiple aspects, I would argue that in the case where we are to discuss culture and the cultural impact of such trends, we need to use primarily the perspective of anthropology. Piotr Mazur describes, among others, three modern approaches to the issue of subject in anthropology. According to him, the subject can be viewed, among others, either as a derivative of its substructures, and this is a naturalistic or materialistic approach, a derivative of overstructures, which is a postmodern or social approach, or a center of acts or experiences. And this is a phenomenological or dialogical perspective. The issue at hand is therefore, to be more precise, one of anthropological naturalism, claim that full understanding of the human being, their personhood, subjectivity, nature, and the like can be derived fully from the biological materialistic substructures of subject. Such a vision of naturalism, represented, for example, by Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, or Jacques Lacan, is related to various other aspects and visions of naturalism, mainly as a specific case of the more general naturalistic claim that all reality can be explained through its materialistic substructures. Nevertheless, it is distinctive, as it deals with the plethora of human creations, of which culture is perhaps the most noteworthy. In the following parts of this presentation, I will demonstrate how the idea that human beings and their creations and their very nature can be reduced to the level of biology and neurochemistry is treated by various Christian and non-religious thinkers. On diverging approaches to anthropological naturalism. Historically, there is a large difference between the sources of opposition to materialism from the side of Christian thought and from the side of modern non-religious philosophies, a difference that seems immediately obvious. While Christianity remains more or less centralized, being a religion where the core doctrinal beliefs about Godhood of Jesus Christ and other supernatural phenomena are shared between almost all denominations, and therefore almost every Christian has a stake in refuting naturalism, alternative ways of thinking about transcendence, very loosely understood, are much less homogeneous. In fact, the very idea of decentralization of knowledge plays a crucial role in at least some of them, meaning that their heterogeneity is not a coincidence but emerges by design, so to speak. As explained by Ahmed, queer theory, for example, is an anti-normative at its basis, which means strong opposition to the very idea of homogeneous social norms and unified frameworks of knowledge. This is also at least sometimes true in post-colonialism, from which arises the concept of decolonization of knowledge, where alternative forms of comprehending the world and our place in it are given its own voice on par with Christianity or atheistic naturalism, what Bad el-Hol and Rajesh Tandon call knowledge democracy. Such knowledge democracy, in turn, takes a more radical shape in vegan philosophy, where not only humans but also animals are granted knowledge and importance and even voice. Between me and Mr. Mole there is no wall that divides, no qualities, skills or other magical rules that divide us from each other, as Heinderek puts it. The basic concept of decentralization, of cultural and ideological pluralism, common in many non-religious philosophies that in some form oppose naturalism, is clearly at odds with the unifying ambitions of Christianity, demonstrated, for example, by the quest for universal truth in education, proposed by Possenti. For those non-religious philosophies, such differentiation between what is true and what is false, what is good and what is evil, as Possenti proposes it, if at all possible, must not be achieved through perspective of one religion, but must be negotiated between different groups, different cultures, or even different species. That is why Christianity and such philosophies as queer theory, post-colonialism, and vegan philosophy remain at odds with each other regarding naturalism, even though both sides agree that naturalism, in its attempt to explain the human being solely through biology and neurochemistry, is not satisfying. Allow me to present some examples of opposition to anthropological naturalism from the side of non-religious philosophies that diverge from the Christian perspective. One version of anthropological naturalism is what Judith Butler, among many others, calls biological determinism, which is a belief that biological substructures determine all forms of human existence. And in the context of Butler's own field of study, that they define our sex, meaning that the very topic of gender as a culture subject is obsolete. In turn, Butler describes a narrative common among certain anti-LGBTQ plus movements that uphold biological determinism, where gender theory is presented as purely constructionist in its nature. Still others claim that gender determines the materiality, denies the materiality of the body, and that it elevates language and culture over the biological science, they write. This is also in line with what Jesse Earl says about anti-trans sentiment among American propagandists, who attempt to utilize a very rudimentary biology and simplified radical versions of anthropological naturalism in order to defend the binary gender division. Buttrell rejects this narrative and claims that what we call our biology is always interacting with social and environmental forces, and we cannot really think about biological facts outside of this interaction. Biological and social forces are together interacting in embodied life. This is a very important category here because this idea of embodied life was much earlier than by Butler here, used by Michel Henry, who is a Christian scholar. And this idea of embodied life can be considered a form of transcendence, though not a metaphysical one, not a strong transcendence, but a form of cultural transcendence. And social transcendence that is irreconcilable with biological determinism and that cannot be connected to the belief that our subjectivity is a derivative of its substructures, fitting into another category where subjectivity is seen as center of acts or experiences. Despite this, many Christian scholars today give at least some credence to the idea of biological determinism regarding the matter of sex and gender, meaning that in this case, gender theory diverges quite drastically from the common Christian perspective. Another example. In her draft on vegan philosophy, Heinderek criticizes our separation from the world of animals and our environment, saying that severance of the bond between humans and animals is a huge problem. Man surrounded himself with a walls of concepts, convictions, beliefs, superstitions. He separated himself from the world and built a pedestal for himself onto which he gladly ascended. She calls for rejection of such a separation that should grow from the ecological concern, from, as she calls it, understanding that we have no more time left for any further egoistic games. Where egoistic clearly means anthropocentric. One particular point of disagreement for her is philosophy of enlightenment, and especially of Descartes, who considered all animals mindless machines, which also means, of course, rejection of the historical foundations of modern naturalism, although those play a very limited role in the modern versions of naturalism. Additionally, one cannot also help but notice that the very form of Heinderek's book is directly opposed to the model of academical knowledge fostered within science in general and research based on naturalistic assumptions in particular. Full of colloquialism, diminutives, and personal anecdotes, her model of reflection brings us back to the matter of knowledge, democracy, as described by Hall and Tandon. What Heinderek proposes instead of anthropocentrism is a kind of ecological pantheism focused around an obviously symbolic figure called Mother Gaia, itself derived from both neo-paganism and aerial examples of eco-philosophy such as that of John Lovelock. This also is a form of transcendence that defies anthropological naturalism. Human beings are here seen as part of something much larger than themselves, meaning, to once again use Mazur's classification, that subjectivity is here seen as derivative of overstructures, though the overstructures in question are a bit atypical because they are not language or society, but they are environment. Needless to say that such pantheistic rejection of anthropocentrism is clearly at odds with the Christian belief in the special place of human beings in nature as imago Dei, and with Christian anthropology in general, represented by such thinkers as St. Augustine, St. Bonaventura, Berkeley, or even in some version by Kierkegaard. Examples such as this, when modern progressive left-leaning non-religious philosophies work against anthropological naturalism, but they also work against Christian thought, are understandably exceedingly common. What seems more interesting then are cases where their critique of naturalism and Christian critique of naturalism are not divergent but convergent. Such cases are few and far between, but they do exist, and analysis of them is the main part of this presentation. Christian thought, converging approaches to anthropological naturalism. There are at least two issues that I could find, in discussion of which some versions of Christian thought and some versions of non-religious thought seem to be in agreement in their critiques of anthropological naturalism. Those are the issue of decolonization of knowledge and the narrative of the culture in crisis, and they are strongly interconnected in at least some contexts. Regarding the colonization of knowledge and knowledge democracy, it is important to note that according to Hall and Tandon, Christianity in the past was a large part of why knowledge today supposedly needs decolonization. More specifically, they write about medieval times and the origins of modern university as the ecclesiastical institution of knowledge dispossession. However, it seems that the story of dispossessing the people from ownership of their ideas in the new medieval universities, which brought ecclesiastical power to those institutions, was just the start of our knowledge story, they say. What followed was what Ramon Grossfugel called four epistemicides of the long 16th century, a process through which, among other things, hegemony of power over knowledge was transferred from the church to science and to Enlightenment era idea of reason, so to naturalism, basically. Though Christianity certainly had some kind of hold over it since recently. Today, though, the situation is different, especially since Christianity is and always was a great many things in itself. Certain schools of thought within it, such as Thomism and modern versions of it, with the Lublin philosophical school, are direct or indirect continuations of the very hegemonic approaches to knowledge described by Hall and Tandon. But other approaches to Christianity can be interpreted as having much more in common with the colonized systems of knowledge than the universal system that colonized them. That is not to say that they were colonized per se, rather that they are equally powerless and removed from the world of science in the sense of naturalism as their colonized counterparts. I am referring here to personalism and philosophy of dialogue, but also to mysticism and even folk Christianity or non-denominational Christianity, such ways of thinking about Christ and his message for the world are the first place, in my opinion, where Christianity meets non-religious philosophies, specifically postcolonialism. Both oppose the hegemony of power over knowledge, currently perceived as being held by naturalism, by naturalistic European sciences since the time of Enlightenment era idea of reason, and both could be seen as striving for more knowledge democracy. This leads us directly into the other issue, the narrative of culture in crisis. As described earlier, the narrative is commonplace in Christian thought, among such scholars as Del Sol, Hrost, or Possenti, and earlier on in the thoughts of Henri. It is interesting to notice, though, that for Henri, the sources of the supposed crisis of culture differ widely from more modern diagnosis of Del Sol and from the panic around wokeness. Henri, in Barbarism, which is older than Del Sol works by some 30 years, focuses his critique on the emptiness of consumer society and especially of modern sciences that arose from the Enlightenment era idea of reason. According to Henri, the crisis in our culture is anthropological one. And this largely echoes the historical idea of colonization of knowledge found in postcolonialism, and it singles out naturalistic sciences as the main cause for perceived crisis in culture. Similar approach to crisis in culture can be seen recently in Possenti, who states that what brought about the crisis of culture is globalization, including instrumental rationality. Interestingly enough, while Del Sol claims that there is strong continuity between Enlightenment era idea of reason criticized by Henri and some modern non-religious philosophies, such as eco-philosophy, in fact, many such philosophies are equally as critical of this version of anthropological naturalism as Henri or Possenti. Especially post-colonialism, with the idea of decolonization of knowledge, is as strong in its rejection of hegemony of naturalistic sciences as Henri is. But queer thought, with its anti-normativity, also participates in that rejection. When Possenti writes about crisis of capitalism, which became manifest in the vehement and dangerous transition from an industrial capitalism to a purely financial one, his sentiments are almost identical to sentiments of many queer theorists, such as Ahmed or Earle. What is important is to note that certain Christian philosophers, such as Henri or Pocenti, in their rejection of anthropological naturalism, at a similar time, for a very similar reasons, explained this critique of naturalism. This kind of similarity goes beyond simply sharing a common enemy, however, and could potentially have important consequences for the very slight possibility of dialogue between those two usually entrenched camps. Okay, so to go to summary, how much time do you have? Okay, perfect. The overview, the overview of the current state of discussion, admittedly rather general, is a testimony of at least theoretical possibility of a very difficult but still a meeting place between Christianity and those non-religious philosophies that I described. While this possibility is very slight, it goes beyond the simple dynamic of sharing a common enemy. Those are not just shared interests in the marketplace of ideas that coincide for no real reason, but possible symptoms of some common, albeit very vague and general values and ideas. Or at least one could hope so, if we consider dialogue between those two groups a worthwhile endeavor. It is certainly true, though, that this possible meeting place is a very difficult one, and that in the eyes of many, the various differences between those two groups may simply outweigh what is common to them. After all, Christian thought seeks to contest anthropological naturalism because of reasons that have to do with transcendental metaphysics, and at the core of Christian beliefs, not because of politically motivated desire for social change. While for Christian thought, discussion with naturalism is then of primal philosophical importance, as a direct apologetic enterprise, for various non-religious philosophies of today, it is of secondary importance. It is a result of other factors, such as the need for decolonization of knowledge, and opposition to social norms or anthropocentrism. As Earl describes it, this is the statement of the goals of such movements. We need to fight back against individuals who uphold these institutions of power, so naturalism, but also realize that those individuals are not the actual target, and that tons of people enforce these institutions and act them out both directly and passively. And it is our job to try to change their consciousness by presenting a different way of seeing and thinking about the world. So this different way is, in some sense, transcending naturalism. This is also interconnected with how Heinderek sees vegan philosophy as a way of thinking and acting that is not easy but full of empathy, respect and love, which is a description I hope we all can agree that also should fit any good Christian philosophy. Returning to the idea that non-religious philosophies are more decentralized and less homogeneous than Christian thought. Somewhat contrary to that, Spivak calls for something more than the promise of liberal multiculturalism, for a way of thinking that goes beyond differences between national and cultural groups, for a way to tie them together. Interestingly enough, Christianity itself is in possession of such a way of thinking in the form of ecumenism. In ecumenism, various Christian denominations come together despite their differences and work for a greater unity of religion itself. It is one of the mechanisms that guarantees basic Christian unity that I described before. Though a meeting place that arises from shared opposition to anthropological naturalism is very different to meeting places created within ecumenism, the very existence of the latter shows that Christianity is not beyond agreeing to even very difficult conversations. Perhaps one reason why this particular opportunity for discussion may be difficult one to come into fruition is the belief on both sides that the debate that sharing a common enemy is not enough for any real cooperation. But as the cases described above prove, there is much more to this discussion than just sharing a common enemy. In a way, there is at least a chance that there is much to be gained by discussing and criticizing naturalism in conversation between Christian and non-religious thinkers. Not only a theoretical possibility, but also a real opportunity for a difficult meeting place in culture. Thank you very much for your attention.